This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of Ritualistic Indignation by Quietlemonhush, composed by Burning Aurora and Kailana. Chapter 1. Remus had not been thinking much when he sunk his teeth into the back of Sirius's magic and let loose the magic that would bind them together forever. He had been thinking even less by the time he bit his thigh, and towards the end, when he left the final claiming bite on the inside of his wrist, winding magic between the two of them so tight it could never be broken, his head was a pleasant, empty buzz with only one word echoing again and again.
Mine.
Of course, he wanted to claim Sirius. He had wanted to claim Sirius since before he fully understood what claiming meant. He had always felt dizzy and seasick at the idea of Sirius being with anyone else, belonging to anyone else. They had been dating for the better part of a year now, and Remus already knew it was a forever kind of thing. Really, the claiming was just a formality. A formality he may have jumped the gun on.
3 times?
Sirius asked, twisting to run his fingers over the bite mark on the back of his neck.
Really had to stake a claim, huh, Lupin?
Anyone might react badly if their partner was kidnapped. Anyone might throw them down and fuck them into boneless incoherence, and leave 3 claiming bites littered around their body like promises. Anyone might knot them twice, fall asleep with them crushed against their body, and hold on to them for several muggy-brained moments when they tried to get up to piss in the night. That was a normal thing to do. It had only been a few hours since Sirius woke up properly. Regulus and James had hovered like fretful parents, James casting diagnostic spells until Sirius swatted his hands away. Regulus had seemed satisfied until he spotted the claiming bite on Sirius's wrist, and then gave Remus a funny, unreadable look, which Remus was sure would turn into a conversation, except Sirius had demanded a reprieve and kicked them out of the room so he could take a shower and get dressed. Which was when he noticed the bites.
You'd just been kidnapped,
Remus said, a bit defensively, heat rising in his face.
It was. I needed to make sure you were, accounted for.
Accounted for?
Sirius arched an eyebrow, a little grin playing on his lips. He was standing in front of the mirror in their guest room at Grimmauld Place, wearing nothing but the skimpy black boxer briefs he insisted on. Not that Remus was complaining. Any chance to see a good thigh, all tattoos and mirth in the afternoon sun. He canted one leg out so he could see the bite mark Remus had left on his inner thigh.
What kind of accounting were you doing?
I should have talked to you first,
Remus said a bit miserably, because it was true, of course. It was very bad form to claim somebody without talking to them about it. Sirius deserved the chance to consent to it.
I got carried away and I'm sorry.
Oh, shut up,
Sirius said, sounding altogether pleased. He flashed his wrist in the mirror, the third bite there still purple and bruised. It would fade, soon. All 3 bites would fade into light silver scars, a thought that made Remus unreasonably happy.
They're my favorite. I love them. You're just an overachiever, is all.
We can undo them,
Remus said, fidgeting with the cuff of his jumper. It made his stomach hurt to say it. He would no more like to release his claim than cut out a vital organ. But if Sirius didn't want it, or wasn't ready for it. The grin fled Sirius's face, and he glowered at Remus.
Say it again and I'll cut off your knot.
I just mean it's your choice, Padfoot. It should have been your choice.
Stop wallowing,
Sirius ordered.
I could have stopped you if I wanted to.
Remus raised an eyebrow.
You were pretty sex drunk.
Your dick isn't that good, Lupin. I still know how to curse you.
You came so hard you blacked out.
You came so hard you blacked out.
Sirius mimicked in a high, mocking voice.
My name is Remus Lupin and I've got a magical knot.
That's not what I said,
Remus protested.
I can do magic with my teeth and my dick, look at me.
Sirius went on.
My balls conjure fire and I jizz liquid luck.
Remus took a swipe at him and Sirius danced out of the way, laughing.
You little shit,
Remus said, lunging properly. Sirius dodged, always quick on his feet, but Remus was good at predicting his moves, and managed to get an arm around his waist, dragging him back against his chest. Sirius kicked at him, and he could have gotten away, strong and fast and sharp, but Remus had an unerring instinct for the ticklish spot under his ribs, and he had barely touched him before Sirius shrieked, flailing wildly at him.
Oh, look at me.
Remus taunted.
I'm Sirius Black. I'm a big strong wizard. I can fight anybody unless I'm being tickled.
Brute!
Sirius gasped out, just as he managed to stomp on Remus's foot. Remus shouted, releasing him at once, and Sirius went skittering away, climbing over the bed and snatching up a pillow to hold over his front, shielding his ribs from Remus's fingers. Remus bounced on one leg, holding his injured foot.
You fight like a baby,
he complained, massaging his toes.
You are a baby,
Sirius said. Remus frowned at him, watching as Sirius shimmied into his jeans, a tingling sense of loss as the bite on his thigh was obscured.
You didn't answer, you know.
Answer what?
Sirius asked, pulling on a white t-shirt and twisting towards Remus. Remus began to roll the sleeves up on instinct. Sirius could never get the cuffs right on his own.
Whether you want to undo the claim,
Remus said quietly, tapping the shirt sleeve with his wand to secure it.
No,
Sirius said flatly, catching Remus's gaze and holding it. His eyes were flinty hard. Remus thought of every stereotype about Omegas being submissive, and wondered if the people who believed them would survive a moment against Sirius.
Do you?
No.
Remus said quickly, his stomach twisting as he considered the idea.
No, I just don't want to take your choice away.
I made my choice about you a long time ago,
Sirius said. He turned so Remus could get at the other sleeve.
I never needed a claim to know I was yours.
Remus held his breath, Sirius's unrelenting loyalty and devotion still overwhelming after years and years of knowing him. He tapped the second sleeve with his wand, looked back at Sirius.
So we're bonded, then,
he said lightly.
Lucky me.
Sirius said, leaning in to kiss Remus.
A handsome alpha all for my own. And he jizzes Felix Felicis.
Remus rolled his eyes, pushed Sirius back.
You're insufferable. I should have claimed some nice, subservient beta.
Should've, would've, could've,
Sirius said airily.
Get dressed. Creature is making cheese potatoes, and if James eats them all before we get down there, I'm going to die.
Remus hadn't worried about Regulus murdering him for years, but things seemed like they might be taking a turn. He was watching Remus with a kind of even contemplation, the same sort of look a heron had before it snatched up a fish. When Remus frowned at him across the dinner table, Regulus smiled politely, darkly amused, and a shiver went up Remus's spine.
Do you think I'm hurting Sirius or something?
Remus blurted out, interrupting James's impassioned speech about why muggles made superior peanut butter to wizards. James stopped abruptly at the words hurting Sirius, crestfallen like someone had told him his dog died. Sirius looked at Remus like he had grown a third head.
Are you?
Regulus asked evenly.
You know I'm not.
Remus protested.
Do I know that?
Regulus asked. He dabbed at the corner of his mouth with his napkin, reminding Remus distinctly of a vampire wiping away their victim's blood.
Yes,
Remus insisted.
You made me do that blood oath.
You made him do a blood oath?
Sirius asked.
You didn't make James do a blood oath.
Regulus demanded, sounding a little wounded.
I did a blood oath with myself,
James said proudly.
We pinky promised.
Sirius said defensively.
It's just as good.
You claimed my brother without my permission.
Regulus said suddenly, fixing Remus with a dark stare.
I'm head of the family and you didn't even consult me.
Your dick gets an inch shorter whenever you say head of the family,
Sirius said with annoyance.
It's got to be tiny by this time, and you never had much to begin with.
He's very well proportioned,
James corrected.
Shut up, prongs, I know.
It was a spur-of-the-moment thing,
Remus said. Sirius's head jerked up and he stared at Remus with genuine hurt in his eyes, which made Remus's stomach plummet.
I mean, I wanted to. I've always wanted to. It wasn't exactly planned. The kidnapping, you know, with Dilk. And I would have talked to you.
You would have asked his permission.
Sirius demanded.
Like I'm a child.
No,
Remus said quickly.
I would have only, there would have been a conversation, you know, we could have made it a group thing.
group sex.
James asked quickly, the frown disappearing off his face.
No.
Remus and Regulus snapped in unison.
You would have fucked me in front of my brother.
Sirius snarled, sounding increasingly irate.
That was your big, romantic plan for our bonding. Were you going to ask his permission before you came?
That's not what I'm saying.
Remus said desperately.
I ask him before I come sometimes.
James said. Regulus gazed at him with smug approval. Sirius gagged.
So you weren't going to ask me before you did it?
Regulus said, turning away from James to stare imperiously at Remus.
You were just going to trot off with the last eligible Omega in the Black family tree.
Do not call me that.
Sirius said darkly, in a tone so low and threatening that Regulus snapped his mouth closed.
What I mean to say, brother,
Regulus said, with quite a bit more deference on the word than he might usually use,
is that the rituals have been neglected.
The rituals?
Sirius repeated. Remus couldn't read the silent conversation he was having with Regulus. It happened too quickly, in a series of rapid, fleeting facial expressions. Whatever it was, Sirius's shoulders came down from around his ears, and some of the looming danger seemed to dissipate.
The rituals,
Regulus repeated agreeably, and Remus was certain the brothers wouldn't duel now, but the way Regulus spoke still made him feel ill at ease.
The ancient claiming rituals of the Black family.
Sirius hummed in agreement, sitting back in his chair.
That's true. They have been neglected, that is.
Remus had never heard of the rituals, but he had absolutely heard Sirius talk in that shit-eating tone of voice before, the bastard. He arched an eyebrow.
What are the rituals, then?
Regulus shrugged, one shoulder lifting and falling with feigned indifference.
It's hard to say. As a beta, I was never inducted into the full demands of.
Oh fuck off, Black, what are the rituals?
Regulus looked a bit put out.
They're ancient, magical rituals. I don't have them memorized.
I don't believe you,
Remus said, because Regulus had the entire fucking family tree memorized as well as each one of his ancestors' biographies. Regulus sniffed.
If you're consenting to undergo the rituals, I'll send you over the first one tomorrow by owl.
Fine,
Remus said, wondering if he would regret it, thinking he almost certainly would. He knew he should tell Regulus to eat shit. But Regulus held a mean grudge, and he'd remember if Remus didn't pander to whatever insane claim the Black family made on Sirius. Worse, there would likely be some horrible ancient curse that would befall them and make Sirius legally bound to be bound to a Goyle if Remus didn't do the rituals right. In any case, he was strong and smart and fierce. He could do it. He could complete some old rituals. He wasn't afraid of the Blacks. Really. Remus took Sirius home that night and kissed him against their bedroom door until Sirius was breathless, one hand clenched in Remus's hair, holding on to him like he was the only person in the world. Remus knew they needed a break. He was still sore from sex, and he hadn't been the one who took 2 knots in one day. But he could feel the claiming bites on Sirius's skin humming at him, sing-songing, and when he brushed his fingers over the mark on the back of Sirius's neck, he couldn't help the way he forced Sirius up on his tiptoes, one thigh slotted between his legs, Sirius grinding against it and moaning.
Gotta go to bed,
Remus murmured, biting at Sirius's lower lip even as he reminded himself to check the calendar. His rut should have been weeks away, but it felt more like hours, the urge to bite and claim and keep rushing through his blood.
You've got that thing with James tomorrow.
Sirius shook his head furiously, ducking his head to nuzzle at Remus's neck.
I'm fine. Don't need sleep.
You were kidnapped,
Remus argued, but he tilted his head back and let Sirius nose along his jaw.
It's okay.
Sirius said.
Take me to bed.
Remus grabbed Sirius's elbows, spinning him abruptly and pushing him back against the door face first. It took him a moment to maneuver them so he could push Sirius's hair over his shoulder and see the mark on the back of his neck, still bruised, all but shimmering with magic.
You aren't sore?
Remus asked, his breath washing over the mark. He was tempted to put his teeth there again, to bite down and hear Sirius's delicious yelp.
So what if I am?
Sirius asked. Remus kissed the bite mark, let out a breath.
If you're sore, we're going to take a rest.
Remus,
Sirius complained.
I think I'm the authority on what my ass can take.
If you had any kind of survival instinct, you might be,
Remus said. He rested his head on Sirius's shoulder, willed his heartbeat under control.
I need to, Sirius, I have to take care of you.
Says who?
Sirius asked, arching so his arse pressed back against Remus's groin. Remus stilled him with 2 hands firm on his hips.
Says me, that's part of what the bond is, taking care of each other.
He gave into temptation and bit down on the nape of Sirius's neck, every part of him preening in satisfaction as Sirius whimpered. Remus released him, kissed where he had bit.
Take off your clothes.
He stepped back to watch Sirius kick his jeans off, tugging his shirt over his head and flinging it across the room. He turned back to Remus, naked and lovely and pleased, his mouth tugging up in a sideways grin. Sirius shook his fingers in what Remus was almost certain was a failed attempt at jazz hands. Remus laughed despite himself, shock and delight racing through him, and he couldn't help the way he pulled Sirius against his chest, kissing him thoroughly.
You twat,
he said fondly, biting at Sirius's lower lip, one hand spreading over his lower back, fingers dipping into his cleft.
You utter and complete idiot.
You're utter and complete idiot,
Sirius said, his lips curling up against Remus's, and then they were too busy kissing to talk. Remus could still feel the lingering haze of the day before, the way everything in him had narrowed to bite and keep and protect, his hands spreading proprietorial over Sirius's skin, sinking his teeth down like he could keep him safe forever, keep him forever. His pulse was loud in his own ears, even as he held Sirius's face between his palms and kissed him until they were both gasping and breathless.
You're really not going to fuck me?
Sirius asked, fingertips dancing along Remus's collar, using it to tug him closer.
Not even a little.
Shut up,
Remus said, because if Sirius kept talking, he would fuck him, and because shut up was practically I love you between them. He walked Sirius backwards, towards their bed.
Does that mean yes?
Sirius asked, and then let out an oof, as Remus pushed him back on the bed. He grinned lazily up at Remus, sprawling and indolent, and Remus loved him so much he thought there would never be another home for him. It would always be wherever Sirius was.
It means you'll take what I give you, and you'll be grateful for it,
Remus said, although he couldn't help but smile when he said it, because Sirius had never been tame and that was part of the allure, really, a werewolf in love with a man much more feral than he. Sirius stretched his arms above his head, and the desire must have shone clear on Remus's face, because he smirked.
All right, that's fine, Mooney.
Sirius said, wiggling a little on the bed, hair strewn over the sheets.
Whatever you say.
Well, that's only taken more than a decade,
Remus muttered, beginning with the buttons on his cuffs.
I'm a very sensible person,
Sirius said. Remus paused to arch an eyebrow.
You're as sensible as a grapefruit, my love.
Sirius shrugged, looked spoiled and indulgent on the bed, so gorgeous Remus could only breathe around him from years of practice. He tipped his chin down towards his shoulder.
It's fine if you won't fuck me, Mooney. I can always find another alpha willing to stake a claim.
Remus glared at him, midway through unbuttoning the top button of his shirt, his fingers stalling near his throat.
That's not funny.
I'm sure it wouldn't take long. I could go outside like this, all slicked up from wanting you, and the scent of it would draw them round.
Hadfoot,
Remus said, or snarled, annoyed at Sirius for riling him up, annoyed at himself for it working. He really had to check the calendar. It was like a rut, the way he was drowning in it, his skin too thin and his bones too big to fit inside it.
Do you think they'd want me?
Sirius asked, blinking up at him with something like innocence on his face.
Do you think I could just bend over and spread my legs and let them fill me up?
Remus lunged, his knees on either side of Sirius's chest, and bit at Sirius's mouth, a growl building in his chest and simmering in the air between them. Sirius laughed into his mouth, pleased like a cat with the cream, and anger flared in Remus's chest.
Brat,
he growled, gathering Sirius's wrists in one hand and holding them over his head.
Spoiled, rotten, demanding little brat.
Sirius tipped his head back, humming as Remus nipped and licked along his throat, dragging his teeth down to his collarbone and sucking marks there.
I should tie you to this bed.
Remus huffed against his skin.
I shouldn't let you come at all.
It's more fun if I do,
Sirius said, wriggling one hand in Remus's grasp.
Let me touch you.
Remus tightened his grip.
I should keep you slicked up and ready for me, available to use when I bloody well feel like it.
Sirius's gaze darkened, his mouth falling open.
Yeah,
he said, swiping his tongue over his lower lip, and Remus tracked the movement with the intensity of a wolf waiting to spring.
Ready to take your knot whenever you want.
Ready to take whatever I say,
Remus corrected, and it sent a sharp line of pleasure down his spine, the way Sirius's breath hitched at his words.
whoever I say.
He went on. Sirius squeezed his eyes shut, a moan tumbling out of his mouth, and Remus grinned, sharp and victorious.
Oh, is it like that, Padfoot? Is that what you'd like?
Mooney.
Teasing me about going to round up other alphas like I wouldn't see how badly you wanted them, how badly you wanted me to give you to them. Isn't that so?
Sirius whined, low in his throat.
Please fuck me.
He managed, cheeks a wild pink.
Please fuck me.
Remus chuckled, sitting back on his heels and looking down at Sirius, who was still, the blush on his cheeks spilling down his chest.
Admit it,
he ordered, his arms crossed over his chest. Sirius looked up at him, tilting his chin up defiantly, all bravado and rebellion, and it was too bad for Sirius that Remus had learned to see through that ages ago.
Admit that I could pull anyone in this neighborhood.
Admit that you only want to if I tell you to,
Remus said smugly, and didn't miss the way Sirius's gaze darkened at his words.
Admit that you'd love nothing more than to be bent over and fucked by anyone I brought in this room, so long as I brought them in this room, because you're mine and you want to be.
There was a moment of silence between them, Sirius's shallow breathing and dilated eyes, and for a second Remus thought he wouldn't admit it, wouldn't break, but then his lashes touched his cheeks and he murmured.
Yes, Mooney.
Yes, what?
Remus asked, running his thumb over Sirius's lower lip.
Yes. I want it's only good if it's you, if you're the one.
Sirius swallowed, his throat bobbing, and then he looked up at Remus with burning eyes.
It's only if it's you, Remus.
Remus surged towards him, their teeth clacking together as they kiss, one hand tight in Sirius's hair, swallowing his moan when Remus bit his lip hard. Remus back far enough to gasp out.
Roll over, on your front.
Sirius obeyed so fast he knocked Remus back with his shoulder, but Remus was quick to eliminate the space between them, settling over Sirius's thighs and unbuttoning his own trousers with impatient fingers. He pulled his own cock out with a grunt of satisfaction, pushing his trousers down as far as he could get them without unseating himself from Sirius's thighs. Remus slid his thumbs down Sirius's cleft, pulling his cheeks apart, and Sirius made a wanton noise low in his throat, pushing back towards him. He ran his thumb over Sirius's rim, pressing lightly, smearing the slick there.
Please.
Sirius begged, arching his back.
Please, I'll be so good, Mooney, anything you say, I need you.
Remus felt for his wand in his back pocket, grasping it, and hissing the banishing charms to rid himself of the rest of his clothes, and then he shifted down and knelt between Sirius's spread legs. It only took a few expert touches to bring Sirius up to his knees, pressing back shamelessly when he felt the tip of Remus's cock against his slick hole.
Anything I say?
Remus asked, rocking forward teasingly, one hand on Sirius's hip.
Anything at all?
Anything.
Sirius groaned.
Then hold on, pads.
Remus murmured in his ear, and pressed himself inexorably forward. Sirius had nothing to muffle his moan with, and it sounded cracked even to his own ears. Remus hadn't stretched him at all, and although he was slick enough to take it, a little loose from the day before, there was still a burn, Remus forcing him open. It made his vision blur, all of his senses focused entirely on the pressure of Remus inside of him, moving into him, huge and demanding. His breath caught, and he had to force himself to exhale, a whine coming with it.
That's it,
Remus whispered, rocking his hips just enough to make Sirius shiver.
Can you take it?
Yes.
Sirius panted, reaching back to clasp his hand on Remus's hip.
Anything, Mooney?
He sucked in a high breath as Remus shifted into him, his body protesting the intrusion even as he welcomed it.
Good boy,
Remus crooned, and Sirius was still reeling from it, from Remus fully inside him, when Remus said,
I'm going to fuck you now.
Sirius began, and then swallowed the noise back when Remus snapped his hips, thrusting hard enough and deep enough to knock a whimpering noise out of Sirius's chest.
Oh fuck.
Sirius gasped.
Oh fuck. Mooney, fuck.
I was going to suck you off, you know.
Remus growled in his ear, one hand rising to pinch viciously at Sirius's nipple, and Sirius couldn't help but whine.
I was going to get you off so sweetly, make you come down my throat, maybe twice.
Merlin, fuck.
Sirius managed, clenching down so hard it almost hurt, the force of Remus inside him.
But then you had to go and be a brat,
Remus said, punctuating his words with a hard thrust, brushing Sirius's prostate.
And now I've got to put you back in your place, Padfoot.
Sirius moaned, and the moan turned into a shout as Remus dropped one hand to his balls and squeezed. He jerked instinctively, which only served to fuck himself back onto Remus's cock, the sensations all confusingly tangled in pain and pleasure. Remus didn't release him, just tightened his grip minutely until Sirius stilled, panting hard, his stomach clenching in trepidation as Remus rolled his hips, grinding into him.
You are never going to joke about fucking around without me again. Is that understood?
Remus asked, his voice low and dangerous.
Mooney.
Don't moony me. I asked if you understood me.
Remus asked, pulsing his grip, and Sirius let out a high, thin keen.
If you do, I'm going to tie you down and swat these with the flogger that you bought as a joke that wasn't at all a joke until you cry, Sirius, and then I'm going to make you admit how much you like it, and I'm not going to let you come, no matter how much you beg me, not for a week. Do you understand me?
Sirius shuddered against him, nodding, head bobbing fast and sharp. Remus released his hold, bringing his hand up instead to Sirius's throat, which he grabbed but did not squeeze.
Good boy,
Remus said, thrusting into him again and again until he could feel Sirius's pulse pounding against the palm of his hand. Sirius was lightheaded, fingers grasping at Remus's arm, bouncing between sensations. Remus was fucking him and holding him and surrounding him, and it felt like home even as it made his legs shake. He tried to push back and felt Remus's teeth snag on his ear.
Remus.
Sirius gasped out, his voice quavering.
Please, Remus.
Remus grunted, and Sirius flailed his arms as he was shoved down to the bed, his hips held up by Remus's grip, and then he could do little else but clench his fingers in the sheets and cry out as Remus went all out, slamming into him with such force that his balls smacked against Sirius's slick damp thighs, the sound squelching and loud. Sirius could feel Remus's knot beginning to pop, the rough press of it against his rim. He reached one hand beneath him, and his fingers had just brushed his cock when Remus wrenched his arm back.
Remus.
Sirius wailed, resisting Remus's hold on his wrist.
You said whatever I say.
Remus's voice was low and rough, breathless.
Put your fucking hand behind your back.
Sirius whined but obeyed, one hand pressed to the small of his back and the other scrabbling at the bedding, twisting and clenching as Remus slammed against his prostate mercilessly, not rubbing at Sirius's rim, reminding him of what it felt like to be full and fucked and overwhelmed in Remus's arms. Remus's thrusts were getting erratic, his knot filling out, and Sirius couldn't help the way his body seized around it, making Remus gasp and groan and finally come, thrusting in one last time so hard it made Sirius's teeth click, his knot wide and demanding in Sirius's arse.
Fucking fuck.
Remus snarled, and then his teeth were clamped down on Sirius's wrist, and he was coming, shaking, filling Sirius completely. Sirius whined pitifully as he felt Remus collapse against him, his own cock still hard and dripping between his legs. His whine transformed into a moan when he felt Remus's fingertips rubbing up his shaft, spreading the precum there.
Fuck, feel how tight you are.
Remus mumbled, maybe to himself.
So fucking perfect. So good for me.
Sirius's hips twitched toward Remus's fingers, dragging little breathless gasps from him at the feel of Remus's knot tugging his rim.
Mooney.
He begged, and he wouldn't beg for anyone, not ever. No one but Remus could drag that desperate tone from him. Remus grasped him with a firm grip, stroking him so fast it was almost too much, and Sirius writhed on his knot, choking and moaning and grabbing at the sheets so hard they ripped beneath his fingers, the sound buried underneath his shout as he came, twisting into Remus's fist, his eyes wet and his back bowed. Remus stroked him through it, grinding into him, little twitching rolls of his hips that made stars burst behind Sirius's eyes. In the panting, sweat-soaked aftermath, Remus pressed his lips to the bruise on the back of Sirius's neck, magic and heat running between them. I love you, he said without saying, pulling Sirius back against his chest. He stroked his fingers over Sirius's low belly, feeling the muscles there twitch and jump with aftershocks.
Say I was right.
Sirius mumbled, turning his head to glance over his shoulder.
Say we needed to do this tonight.
Remus laughed against his neck, humming low and pleased.
You were right, you monster. Are you happy now?
More than.
Sirius said with a yawn, dropping into exhaustion the way he always did after sex. He huffed and grumbled as Remus rolled them onto their sides, but settled when Remus's arm came around his middle.
So nice.
Sirius mumbled.
Go to sleep,
Remus said fondly, nosing at his neck. He wouldn't fall asleep for ages, not until his knot went down, but Sirius would conk out immediately.
You can't tell me what to do.
Sirius sighed.
I'm an alpha at heart.
So you are.
Remus agreed.
If you go to sleep, I won't tell anyone how cuddly you are after sex, all right?
Thanks, Mooney.
Sirius yawned. A blanket lifted up and draped over them, seemingly of its own accord, although Remus recognized the taste of Sirius's magic when it brushed against his skin. Sirius nosed into the blanket, yawning again.
Gotta keep my secrets.
Chapter 2. Regulus's letter arrived with the morning paper, a thick slip of parchment tied around its ankle. He fed the tawny eagle who delivered it a treat, sparing a quick glance at Sirius, who was awake and dressed unusually early. Very few things could get him out of bed that early, but James Potter was an exception to most of the rules.
James meeting you here?
Remus asked, breaking Regulus's wax seal and unrolling the parchment.
At Potter Manor.
Sirius yawned, rubbing at his eyes.
Fuck. Don't know why these things have to be so early.
It's 8 a.m., love.
So what I said.
Sirius said indignantly.
Fucking dawn. I'm beat.
Are you two doing something fun?
Remus didn't particularly feel like letting Sirius out of his sight at the moment, but if anyone would keep him safe, it was James. Possibly arrested, but never hurt. James was reliable like that.
Fixing the wards.
Sirius said, coming close enough to press a messy kiss to Remus's cheek.
Gotta keep Effie and Monty safe.
Say hi for me, won't you?
Remus asked. He slid one arm around Sirius's waist, pulled him down into his lap. Sirius didn't resist, and came with a little huff of air.
You could come,
Sirius said, and Remus was tempted not to let Sirius move anywhere without shadowing his steps. But Sirius didn't thrive when suffocated, and part of loving him was letting him be free, even if Remus felt like wrapping him in gauze and keeping him in his pocket for a few days longer. He smiled, kissed Sirius's cheek.
I'll be here when you get home for lunch,
he said instead, and squeezed Sirius to his chest.
Besides, if it's all three of us, we'll never get any work done.
Sirius snorted, nosed at his jaw.
Your loss. But yeah, I'll tell them you say hi.
He stood, and immediately Remus missed his warmth.
Love you, Mooney.
I love you too,
Remus said, and watched him disappear into the flue. He allowed himself a proper moment of moping before he looked back down to the letter in his hands. It looked ancient, the parchment curled at the edges and burnt in places. There was a lot of verbiage, at least half of it in French, and a good deal more in Latin. Remus groaned, scrubbed at his eyes, and fetched his dictionary. It took him the better part of an hour to translate the letter, and by the time he did, he was ready to yank Regulus's hair at the roots, because it wasn't even an original text. Regulus had written it that morning, and the little shit had intentionally done it in 3 different languages.
Free fucking familial allies,
Remus muttered, looking down at the letter. That was the first demand of the ancient and most noble rituals, to secure the approval and backing of 3 adult members of the House of Black. A little card fluttered out of the letter, a name written in Regulus's even script. A place to start, Andromeda Tonks née Black, 232 Ashwhite Lane. Remus fidgeted as he walked up Ashwhite Lane, the cobbles uneven and ancient under his feet. He had heard of Andromeda, of course, and vaguely remembered seeing her at James and Regulus's wedding, a willowy figure in a blue dress, but that was years before. Sirius talked about her with a mix of wild affection and careful respect. But Remus had never met her properly. He had certainly never sent her an owl and asked if she would meet him for tea because her cousin had discovered or invented some kind of stupid hoops for him to jump through in order to bond with Sirius properly. He hadn't expected her response so quickly, her handwriting just as perfect as Regulus's, the invitation to come over that morning if he liked. Her home was far outside London, out in the country, and he had to apparate several times to get to the nearest village. He had to walk even farther then, strolling into the fields, and twice he had to stop and ask directions. He half expected a big, Gothic estate, maybe guarded by hippogriffs and redcaps, the kind of home Regulus and Sirius had described their grandparents living in. He did not expect a 2-story cottage nearly buried under wildflowers. When he came through the gate, 232 Ash-White Lane painted on a little willow sign hung on the hedge, he could sense the magic of the place instantly. There were birds everywhere, a summertime breeze on the back of his neck. He spotted fairies darting through the wisteria, a bowtruckle climbing up a yew tree in the corner of the yard. It seemed more like a place of comfort and rest than anywhere a member of the Black family would live. Remus raised his hand to the knocker on the door, and caught his breath when it opened to him automatically. He looked instinctively for a house elf, but instead there was a man, a few years older than him, with soft blue eyes and a face so kind Remus found himself instinctively smiling at him.
You must be Remus,
the man said, opening the door wide.
I'm Ted. Nice to meet you,
Remus said, hesitating.
Is this? It is,
the man agreed.
You're here to see my wife, Andromeda.
When Remus nodded in agreement, the man smiled.
Great, you're an alpha, then. Oh, yes.
Remus rubbed the back of his neck, imagining Sirius, the bite that was there on his nape.
I'm happy to invite you in, and Regulus has spoken for you, but you'll want to avoid any use of the voice in this home.
Remus nodded quickly. He avoided the voice with strangers on principle. It was rude, and anyway he was fairly certain any cousin of Sirius and Regulus would kill him for the impertinence.
I will, of course,
Remus said.
And you'll not touch my wife,
Ted said, some of the friendly look draining out of his eyes.
Is that understood?
Remus held his hands up in surrender.
I would never,
he said fervently. Ted smiled then, stepping back from the door.
Great, come on in. Andromeda is in the sun room.
Remus followed Ted into the house. The inside was just as surprising as the outside, not ornate or Gothic or very fancy at all, just simple and lovely, a home his mother might have lived in. There were books everywhere, and plants as well, a bird singing somewhere deep in the house. As he followed Ted, the bird song got louder, until they came abruptly to a room of mostly windows, strewn with dozens of flowering plants and a handful of colorful birds flapping about near the ceiling, singing cheerfully. In the room was a strikingly beautiful woman, and if Remus wasn't so used to Sirius he might have done a double take. She did look quite a bit like Sirius, at that, the same sharp cheekbones, gray eyes, long and curling hair. There were differences though. Her hair was lighter than Sirius's, and her face more heart-shaped. She seemed more poised than Sirius did, like whatever sharp edges she had were hidden under layers and layers of elegance.
Thank you for agreeing to meet with me on such short notice,
Remus said, his throat dry.
My name is Remus.
Andromeda Tonks,
she said, her voice all crisp vowels and clean lines as Sirius's had been back in first year.
Please sit.
Remus sat in a wicker chair across from her, his hands folded on his lap. He could feel Ted's presence somewhere behind him, and it wasn't until Andromeda spoke that he understood why.
Thank you, darling. Will you be in your shop?
Just on the other side of the windows,
Ted said, the smile evident when he spoke.
Call if you need me.
Remus listened as Ted's footsteps receded, Andromeda fixing him with a gaze so steady he almost squirmed. He had the distinct impression that she didn't receive a lot of alpha visitors, that he had been declared some kind of tenuous exception, and he wasn't certain why.
Regulus says you and Sirius are bonded,
Andromeda said, crossing one pale leg over the other. He caught a glimpse of her narrow ankle and looked away.
We are.
Remus said, then cleared his throat.
Just recently. He was. There was a man.
Yes, I heard.
Andromeda said.
And what are your intentions now?
My intentions. Well, Sirius and I talked about a tracking charm on each other. He's not keen on being monitored, but he said if we both did it, it'd be a more equitable thing, and I agree.
I mean your intentions with my cousin. Now that you're bonded.
Remus frowned. He knew he was missing something.
You mean, we already live together, so.
Andromeda arched an eyebrow.
With enough room for a nursery.
Sirius doesn't want children.
Remus said, which was true. They had talked about it a few months back, and Sirius had mumbled that he wasn't sure he ever would, and Remus had kissed him, long and sweet and slow, and murmured,
We don't need a child for this to be real, us.
And then he'd considered buying a pensive just to capture the quiet contentment on Sirius's face.
And
Andromeda laughed a little, sounding cold and cruel, and Remus shrank back.
he's an omega, Lupin. You have the voice. Wait until his heat and...
No.
Remus said sharply, his pulse thudding in his ears at just the thought.
That's not.
Then what are you going to do with him?
Andromeda asked.
Keep him about for heats. Enter fine society with Regulus. You'd have a place, of course. I'm sure he could find you a seat on the Wizengamot, and no one would protest, not with that one on your arm. If they did, just loan him out for a night and that'll settle it.
This was a mistake,
Remus said, rising, bile hot in his throat, even as he wondered how Regulus could steer him so wrong.
Excuse me.
He'd thank you for it. For making him of use. For putting him in his place.
Andromeda smiled a slow, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes.
You could do anything with him. That's the pleasure of an omega. Once the heat hits, they're mindless. You could pass him around to your friends and...
Stop talking,
Remus whispered, his fists clenching.
What's wrong, Lupin? Surely you know the advantages an omega presents.
Don't speak about him like that. Don't speak about him at all. He isn't a thing, and he isn't a doll to be, that's inhuman, it's fucking madness, and if you ever talk of him like that again, so help me I will.
Remus didn't even hear Ted coming, just suddenly saw him there, at Andromeda's side, his wand clenched in his hand. For a moment he thought he'd be attacked, 2 against 1, and he was angry enough to try and win it anyway. But then Andromeda lifted her hand, and smiled a very different kind of smile, gentler and more pleased.
It's all right, Ted.
She said.
It's my fault.
Andy, you didn't.
Ted sighed, his shoulders sagging as he lowered his wand.
I told you that was a bad idea.
I needed to know. Sit down, Lupin.
No, thank you. This was a mistake.
It wasn't.
Andromeda said, seeming not at all fazed by his venom.
I just needed to make sure we shared values.
We don't. I'm not going to horse Sirius out to the Wizengamot, so I don't think I'm your kind of society.
That is precisely why you are my kind of society.
Andromeda said, brushing her hair off of her shoulders.
Sit down, Lupin. It was a test and you've passed. Haven't you met a Slytherin before? Saying provocative things to see how you feel is practically casual banter.
Andy,
Ted said, frowning now.
what did you say?
Only a few of my father's best lines.
Andromeda said, and flashed Remus a smile.
Come on, now. I wouldn't harm Sirius for all the gold in the world. I was the first family disappointment, you know. And the first black omega.
Andromeda,
Ted said sternly. He looked up at Remus and sighed.
I'm sorry, she really didn't mean any of that. She does love Sirius.
Remus hesitated, anger still rippling up his spine.
You're an omega.
He managed.
Always have been.
Andromeda said pleasantly.
So why would you say all of that? You know what that's like.
Yes.
Andromeda said, leaning back in her chair.
I know precisely what that's like.
Remus sat heavily, meeting her gaze.
Tell me,
He said.
Tell you what.
Tell me what you're trying to teach me about Sirius.
Andromeda's mouth quirked up in an almost smile.
Who said I'm trying to teach you anything about Sirius?
I don't think you're putting on this show for your own amusement.
You're as smart as Regulus says.
And you're delaying. What is this? Do you think I'd hurt Sirius?
No, Lupin.
Andromeda said.
I don't think you'd harm my cousin. Regulus wouldn't have sent you here if that was the case, and frankly I think Sirius could best you in about 10 minutes flat, voice or no.
She waited for his reaction, but he didn't have one. It was true, and he knew it. She smiled.
Tell me what you know about the Black family.
Bunch of posh assholes with too much dark magic and a fixation on power,
Remus said.
More or less.
Andromeda said agreeably.
And then Regulus took charge and made it more bearable for everyone, didn't he?
Andromeda nodded.
Regulus took charge by dueling his father to the death. A duel that he won on his 16th birthday.
To the death.
Remus frowned.
All the papers said Orion and Wahlberger fled to France.
It saved an investigation.
Andromeda said, waving one hand dismissively.
Their remains were interred at the family mausoleum. There wasn't much left.
Remus was silent, considering. He had been in his 7th year when Regulus took charge of the family. He had barely known Regulus, who refused to talk to Sirius for most of their Hogwarts career and then, suddenly, in 6th year, was always around. Sirius had said he'd had a change of heart. Now, Remus knew that Sirius had hidden it from everyone, that Regulus came back because
Regulus took control of the family to protect Sirius,
Remus said slowly. Regulus had mentioned as much the year before, when Sirius presented again.
To prevent them from
doing what they did to me,
Andromeda said plainly, without any self-pity in her voice.
What did they do to you?
Remus asked, not certain he wanted to know the answer. Andromeda smiled, turning her head to where Ted's hand still rested on her shoulder. She kissed his wrist.
Do you want to stay, pet?
Ted grimaced.
I'm all right.
My family did not approve of my choices.
Andromeda said, turning back to Remus.
Actually, my family did not approve of me making choices at all, as I was meant to allow others to make those choices for me. I was meant to marry a pure-blood alpha and produce pure-blood heirs. When I decided not to follow this plan, my family attempted to correct me. At a certain point, they believed the time for correction had passed.
You don't have to shield me,
Ted said.
She fell in love with a half-blood alpha. That was the issue.
I rather think it was the half-blood piece.
Andromeda said dryly.
They'd have forgiven you for being an alpha.
You too, in my 3rd year,
Remus said.
I remember. Sirius told me you were leaving the family.
A complicated emotion passed over Andromeda's face, and Ted's fingers tightened on her shoulder.
Yes,
She said.
I did try. My sister found me before I could get to Ted.
She looked up at Remus again, her eyes full of some kind of emotion, anger and sorrow and a kind of ache that took his breath away.
It was another 2 years before I was able to leave.
Remus held his breath. He imagined Sirius, imagined being separated from him for years, the bond between them so fresh and vivid. It hurt deep in his chest, like a muscle tearing.
2 years,
he said weakly.
I'd already been sullied by black standards, so they needed to pass me off, and quick.
Andromeda said.
They attempted to force a bond.
Remus glanced up at Ted, whose face was white, as if hearing the story still hurt him even after he lived through it.
I'm sorry,
Remus said.
I didn't know you even could. Force one, I mean.
Andromeda shrugged.
You can't. And if you try, it will kill the Omega who resists it. Like an autoimmune disease, it wires their magic against them, destroys their body. It's a war with your magical core, and the magical core always wins.
Remus felt cold. He thought of Sirius, twisted apart from the inside out, broken by the magic he loved so much. What if Sirius really wasn't okay with this? What if it was already happening?
You?
He asked, his voice little more than a whisper. Andromeda inclined her head.
I was bonded 4 times. When my family realized it hadn't taken the first time, a favor for an old family friend, you see, a mostly useless Omega daughter and a vile old bastard who was more wrinkle than life and could look past some prior use, then they kept trying, thinking if they found a strong enough magical component, it would take.
But it didn't,
Remus said.
It didn't.
Andromeda agreed.
Instead I grew sick. First magically, and then physically. I suspect I would have died.
She smiled again, and the effect of it was like the sun rising.
Luckily for me, the House of Black always underestimated Hufflepuffs. Ted fought my sister and my parents, and brought me home.
She held out her left wrist, where a thin silver scar shimmered. Ted rolled his sleeve up, revealing a matching mark on his own wrist.
You claimed each other.
Remus asked.
It's a two-way marriage, son. It seems like a two-way bond would be fitting.
Ted said.
And anyway, if you think you can bed a black without being claimed by them.
Edward.
Andromeda said, sounding scandalized, but there was humor in her eyes.
Don't be crass.
You married me for my crassness.
Ted said with a wink.
I married you to save my own life.
Andromeda said flippantly, but she tilted her head up towards Ted with a look of adoration on her face.
The fact that you are delightfully crass was just a perk.
How did you fix it?
Remus asked breathlessly.
Twin claiming bites.
Ted said with a little shrug.
The cure is consent, but fat luck explaining that to the ancient and most saggy house of tits.
The only cure for a magical infection is a magical antidote, of course.
Andromeda sat, rubbing the pads of her fingers over the bite mark on her wrist.
Like a successful bonding.
It makes sense.
Remus said.
I just didn't think about. Sirius is so bloody strong, really, and all the things people say about Omegas don't. I mean, he's beat me at every duel we've ever done and I don't even think he was trying half the time. I don't want submission and all that. I don't want that from him.
He looked up at Andromeda, who was gazing at him with something that bordered approval.
I just love him, is all. I'm just really very in love with him.
Take pity, Andy,
Ted said.
The poor man's down hard.
Andromeda let out a sigh like she had been defeated.
Well, clearly he must be in love with you as well, as Regulus hasn't owled me about any magical infection burning him up. Very well, then, Mr. Lupin,
she said, smoothing her hands over her legs.
You've passed my little test. You may consider me your first ally for the ancient rituals.
Remus went straight to Grimmauld Place after he left Andromeda's home, and when he came through the flue, he couldn't help the way he beelined for Sirius, grabbing him in his arms, burying his face in the soft junction of Sirius's shoulder.
Padfoot,
he said tightly. Sirius's arms came around him, a startled laugh spilling out of him.
Okay, Mooney.
I missed you,
Remus said. Sirius smelled like cloves and spice, and Remus could not stop thinking of being separated from him for years, of Andromeda's scars on his pale skin, of what would have happened if Regulus lost the duel. He couldn't stop grieving it, the fate he so narrowly avoided, the fate Andromeda couldn't avoid at all. It ached in his chest even as he held Sirius in his arms.
Are you okay?
Sirius asked, concern in his voice.
Moons.
Yeah,
Remus said roughly, refusing to let go.
Yeah, I'm fine. I just missed you.
I can see that.
Sirius said softly, a tinge of concern there, and Remus couldn't manage to explain it, so he just held him tighter.
Did you miss me?
James asked, somewhere behind Remus. Remus finally lifted his head. He turned to flash a watery smile at James and found Regulus staring at him intently, a question in his eyes. Remus nodded his head once, and Regulus hummed to himself, turning away. That night, Remus cooked Sirius's favorite curry and listened to him singing along to Joan Jett, dancing in the living room. Occasionally he peeked into the other room, but Sirius was a whirl of limbs and movement, a one-man mosh pit, singing so loud that if Remus hadn't charmed the flat with so many silencing spells, someone would have surely called the police. Sirius was a terrible singer, off-key and warbling at the best of times, but Remus couldn't possibly tease him for it tonight, Andromeda's words still echoing in his mind.
You're sulking,
Sirius announced loudly, bursting into the kitchen and launching himself at Remus, who stumbled back towards the cabinets under his weight.
What did Regulus do to you?
I'm not sulking, I'm cooking curry.
Remus huffed.
They aren't mutually exclusive, Lupin.
Sirius said as he climbed up on a countertop.
Tell me why you're sulking.
I'm not.
Tell me or I'll tell James about the salty pretzel.
Remus frowned.
What's the salty pretzel?
You know. That position you like so much. When I'm topping and I push your legs back so far that you can come in your own mouth.
Remus startled, dropping his wooden stirring spoon on the counter with a clatter.
You named it, Sirius.
Of course I named it. So I could put it in my sex diary.
Your sex what?
Sirius scoffed.
Like I'm going to risk losing memories of our sex life. I waited years to have you, Mooney. I record it all for posterity.
Remus had to lean over the counter then, digesting the information slowly.
First of all,
He said slowly,
I'll need to see the diary. Second of all, if you tell James that I will murder you.
Sirius waved one hand unbothered.
Just tell me what's got you sulking.
I'm not sulking, I'm thinking. I met your cousin today.
The color abruptly drained from Sirius's face.
Bellatrix.
What? No, isn't she the, no, Andromeda?
Sirius rubbed one hand over his face.
Don't say vague shit like that, Mooney. Most of my cousins are evil Dementor Banshee hybrids. You can't just say you met one.
I don't think Dementors and Banshees can mate.
Remus said speculatively.
You haven't met Bellatrix.
No, I met Andromeda, and she's perfectly lovely.
He paused, stirring the sauce, gleaming golden and fragrant on the cooktop.
And a little frightening.
Oh, fucking terrifying.
Sirius agreed with a grin.
But she's great. How'd you meet her? She never meets alphas.
Remus shrugged.
I wrote to her, for the rituals.
The rituals require you to meet Andy.
The rituals require me to have 3 allies.
Remus paused with a frown, and glanced sidelong at Sirius.
Right.
Oh, of course.
Sirius said, bobbing his head.
I forgot that bit. The first ritual, isn't it? Well, it's nice they ease you in. Save the hardest for last.
The hardest.
How was Andy?
Remus frowned down at the sauce.
She was, well, frightening, as I said. Her husband's nice.
Ted's fit as fuck.
Sirius sighed, and when Remus glanced over at him with an arched eyebrow, he quickly schooled the dreamy look off his face.
You know, for my cousin-in-law.
Aha.
Remus said, unimpressed.
Good cover up there.
Don't be jealous. You bit me thrice.
Sirius jostled Remus with his foot.
All right, so you met Andy and Teddy boy. Ted, I'll just call him Ted. And you are now twice as frightened to be bonded with me because my family is so odd.
I knew how odd your family was a long time ago, you pillock. And I'm not frightened to be bonded with you. Did you know they both have claiming bites?
No.
Sirius said.
But I'm not surprised. Andromeda is territorial.
They say it makes their bond stronger.
Remus said.
It's not just one way.
Sexy.
Sirius agreed, kicking his feet so his heels bounced against the cabinet.
Do you want a nibble, then?
Shut up, Sirius. She was telling me about.
Remus drifted off, staring down at his pot.
About what happened to her. With your family.
Oh.
Sirius said, some of the humor going out of his voice.
And I was thinking about you, about, if you ever got.
Remus choked, unable to form the words.
I'll bite you.
Sirius said suddenly, and Remus expected to see mirth in his eyes, but instead he looked solemn.
Claim you, I mean. I'd, if you want.
Of course I'd want that.
Remus said with a little frown.
Don't the 3 bites prove that?
Wanting to claim me and wanting me to claim you are 2 different things.
Sirius said. When Remus stared at him, he shrugged his shoulders.
Lots of people have wanted to claim me, Mooney, it's.
I am not lots of people.
Of course you aren't. No, I know that. But.
Sirius sighed, pushed his hair back from his face.
A lot of alphas see it as weak. To be claimed. My parents never claimed each other.
Do you see it as weak to be claimed?
Remus asked, a horrible feeling in the pit of his stomach. It hadn't been about weakness and strength, those 3 bites. It had been about love, about trust and care and adoration, and for Sirius to think.
I mean, yeah.
Sirius said with another shrug.
Or I thought it would be. They always told me. You know that omegas were weak. My father used to say.
He trailed off, and Remus ached at the look on his face, the rawness there. But then Sirius shook his head, the corner of his mouth curling up.
But they were wrong. Because I didn't feel weak when you claimed me. I felt loved. I felt like you loved me so much.
I do.
Remus said, his voice quavering a little.
I do love you so much.
I love you too.
Sirius said, looking delighted and content and calm, like everything he had ever wanted was there in front of him, would never be taken away.
And I want you to feel like that. How I felt.
Remus stepped closer, between his legs, resting his forehead against Sirius's.
I want you to claim me, Sirius,
he said softly, resting his hands on Sirius's thighs.
I want to be yours just as much as you're mine.
Yeah.
Sirius asked, beaming so brightly at him that Remus couldn't believe he had ever thought of anything else. He'd have to remember to send Andromeda and Ted a thank you.
Yeah.
Remus said, pressing a kiss to Sirius's lips.
Will you?
Sirius twined his arms around Remus's neck, nipping his lip.
Of course I will.
Sirius murmured.
You're mine, aren't you?
Always have been,
Remus said, and didn't miss the way Sirius's eyes darkened in pleasure.
How could I be anything else?
Sirius slid off the countertop, walking Remus backwards until his back touched the wall.
Yeah.
He said, his voice low and husky.
Not for anybody else. Just me.
Just you.
Remus agreed, tilting his head back. He could feel Sirius's hands slipping into his trousers, his lips plush and soft against his neck. He thought Sirius would go quickly. He was always impatient, quick to the punch. But instead he took his time, stroking and squeezing Remus slowly, fingers teasing Remus to hardness before he had even stripped his trousers off. Remus closed his eyes, allowed himself to feel held, to feel loved, the way Sirius said he wanted him to feel. Remus sighed in contentment when he finally felt Sirius pushing his trousers down, letting his cock go free. His eyes fluttered open just far enough to see Sirius lick a broad stripe down his own palm, and then grasp Remus again, his hands slick and warm and perfect. Sirius played him like a musical instrument, his fingers massaging over the sensitive skin at the base of his cock.
My perfect Mooney.
Sirius sighed, sounding for all the world like he was the one being pleasured, like just seeing Remus enjoy something made him enjoy it too. Sirius brought his hand back to his mouth, licking it again, lapping pre-cum off his fingers with little licks. Remus groaned, watching Sirius taste him and then take him back in hand, stroking faster now.
Fuck, Sirius.
Remus gasped, head thumping back against the wall.
Fuck, that feels good.
Sirius's lips moved over his collarbones, leaving bites and kisses there, teeth scraping over the skin.
Just feel good for me.
Sirius murmured.
Want you to feel so good. Want you to come all over my hand, and then I want to lick it up so I never forget the taste of you, forget that you're mine.
Remus's hips bucked of their own accord at the thought, Sirius covered with his cum and scent, marking him. Sirius chuckled darkly in his ear, snagging Remus's earlobe with his teeth.
Do you like that? Like the idea of me tasting you? I like it. Sometimes it's all I can think about, your cock and your knot and the way you smell.
Remus fought off a desperate urge to grab Sirius's wrist and push him to his knees. He wanted everything at once, to be in Sirius's hand and throat and arse, to fuck him and be fucked by him, and to twine together so tightly they became one thing. He felt overheated with it, and the effort to stay still, to let Sirius stroke him languidly without touching him back made his hands twitch. As if hearing his thoughts, Sirius murmured a quiet charm, and Remus found the choice was taken from him. His hands were stuck fast to the wall, unable to move. He let out a little snarl, fighting against it, and Sirius chuckled again. It shouldn't have made his stomach flip like that, a pleasant rush up his spine.
Poor Mooney.
Sirius murmured.
Has to sit still and let me make the decisions for once.
Sirius murmured another spell, his own genes disappearing, and Remus moaned at the sight of his cock, flushed and pink and gorgeous.
Hadfoot.
Remus near-whined.
Let me touch you.
Hush.
Sirius said, kissing Remus almost chastely.
Let me, Mooney.
He said it so sweetly, his breath warm on Remus's lower lip, and Remus couldn't deny him a thing in the world. Sirius stroked him faster now, his own cock pressed up against Remus's. Remus couldn't help but rock his hips against him, the slick glide of Sirius's hand and his cock so warm and good and right. He whined when Sirius pressed the heads together, rubbing his thumb in maddening little circles. A knot was forming low on his cock, swelling against nothing, and every time Sirius's cock bumped against it he almost howled.
I love you.
Sirius whispered again and again, saying it like a promise against Remus's skin. He rocked in time with Remus, the two of them slick together, smelling of each other, Remus gasping against the wall of their kitchen, dinner forgotten and burning on the stove.
I love you, I love.
Sirius gasped, his fingers dropping lower, rubbing firm over his knot, and Remus cried out as his orgasm hit. Sirius massaged his knot unrelentingly, biting into his shoulder, magic twining between them and pulling tight. Remus was sightless with pleasure, moaning and jerking as he came, and then Sirius was coming too, a mess between them, a world between them, and the two of them so twined you could never separate one from the other ever again. Chapter 3. Remus woke up in the glory of Sirius's arms, as relaxed and at ease as he had ever been. Sirius was hot against him, bare chest pressed to Remus's back, one strong arm thrown around his waist. They'd been dating around a year, but sometimes it felt like much longer than that. After all, Sirius had been his best friend for over a decade. But there were moments like this one, waking up naked and shameless with Sirius's scent all over him, that still felt so breathtakingly new and golden. He extricated himself with care from the cradle of Sirius's arms, pressing a pillow in his place. Luckily, Sirius was always difficult to wake in the early morning, and did little more than snuffle at the pillow before his breathing sank back into the deep patterns of the well-rested. Remus got dressed silently, shimmying into a jumper and jeans, and scratched a quick note that he left stuck to the bedroom door in the unlikely circumstance that Sirius woke. When he came through the flue to the receiving parlor of Grimmauld Place, the curtains were still closed. Regulus and James were early risers, but Remus had beaten even them, and he approached their bedroom with care. He had walked in on James and Rutt more times than he preferred to admit, and while there was certainty and aesthetic appeal, James being all dark skin and muscle, Regulus just as fey and stunning as his brother, Remus was not in the mood for the hex that would inevitably follow. Luckily, Creature intercepted him, fixing Remus with a scowl at the top of the stairs.
The good Regulus is not being awake yet.
Creature said sullenly.
Use is not invited.
Are they shagging?
Remus asked. He had given up on getting on Creature's good side. Regulus said it took time, but so did growing a forest, and in terms of their relationship, they were still at the seedling stage. Remus was only going to live so long, and it seemed Creature's distaste of him would be longer. Creature made an affronted noise.
Use is not being invited to know the marital loves of this house.
Creature, I'm going to walk into that room, and if you don't answer me and I walk into them shagging, I will point a finger your way.
Remus said, and then, considering, added.
But if you help me, I'll nominate you for that House Elf of the Year award Lily is running.
Creature paused to consider. He loved accolades and hated blame. Finally, he toed the ground.
Creature will be needing many nominations.
I have many friends,
Remus said.
At least 12.
Creature asked, eyeing him suspiciously, like he very much doubted Remus's ability to have such an extended friend group. Remus did some quick math in his head before nodding.
15,
he said.
15 nominations, if you like.
They is both sleeping,
Creature said, disappearing with a little pop. Remus took a step, and he appeared again.
Do not be forgetting. Creature makes use many cups of tea. Easy for something to fall in.
You don't have to threaten my life,
Remus grumbled as Creature disappeared again. He quietly opened the door and stepped inside the quiet of James and Regulus's bedroom. Inside, it was just the sound of them sleeping, Regulus mumbling to himself, and James's even breathing. Remus moved to James's side of the bed. He always slept closest to the door and put one hand over his mouth, the other on his shoulder.
James,
he murmured.
Prongs, wake up.
James's eyes flickered open, and despite the fact that Remus was covering his mouth, he could still see James's smile by the way his eyes crinkled. He made a muffled noise which was surely Remus's name. Remus jerked his head, and James slid out of the bed. Belatedly, Remus realized James was naked and heaved a little sigh.
Really?
He whispered, as if he had not woken naked less than 20 minutes before.
I like to let things air out,
James said, making a little circle with his hips, his dick swinging against his thigh.
Let the boys breathe.
Remus closed his eyes and, with the wisdom he had won over years of being friends with James Potter, chose not to comment. Instead, he went back out into a hallway, waiting for James to close the door behind him. James did, but continued stretching as soon as he was in the hall, bending at the waist and wriggling his hips.
What are you doing?
Remus demanded.
Morning stretches,
James said.
You're flashing that portrait of Regulus's grandfather your whole asshole,
Remus said.
That's why I do my morning stretches here,
James agreed. He turned over his shoulder to smile at the portrait. It was a man who looked distinctly regal and rich, frothing at the mouth as he took in the sight of James Potter's arse-crack.
I need to talk to you,
Remus said.
Sure,
James agreed. He straightened and then lifted one knee towards his chest, flashing Remus his balls.
What about?
You have to be my ally.
James frowned, his face growing serious.
I'm always your ally, Remus John Lupin. I'm your best friend. I'm on your side. I love you. Do you want a list of things I love about you? I have it written in my nightstand.
No, you do.
James nodded.
Of course.
Well, maybe later. First, I need you to be my ally for the rituals.
Oh,
James said, and then blew out a long breath like he was considering something difficult.
What?
Remus demanded.
it's just a very serious thing,
James said.
Are you kidding me? What happened to you're my best friend and you're on my side and you love me?
I am your best friend and I am on your side and I do love you,
James said. He bounced on his heels a little as he spoke and his dick wobbled.
but it's a very serious ritual, Mooney. I can't just go throwing my approval willy-nilly.
I'll show you willy-nilly,
Remus growled.
Now,
James said, patting his arm.
no need to get wolfy on me. I haven't said no, have I? I just need, perhaps, a bribe, or...
The bribe is I've been your friend over a decade and I won't shove my fist up your ass if you agree to be my ally.
Remus snapped.
Does that mean I get to fist you if I do, or...
Prongs,
Remus said in a dangerous voice.
Oh, alright, you've twisted my arm.
James huffed.
I'll be your ally, but only on one condition.
What bloody condition?
James smiled serenely.
Do morning stretches with me.
Right now.
Right now.
Remus hesitated. He knew James well enough to know there was a catch.
That's it. Morning stretches. For one day.
Yeah, then I'll cook you breakfast and send you home to Sirius.
Fine.
Remus agreed.
Great.
James beamed.
Take off your kit.
What?
You can't stretch with clothes on. How else is grandfather Watch's butt going to see your ass?
I don't want grandfather Watch's butt to see my ass.
Remus cried.
Sure you do. Then you can join me in my morning, asshole for an asshole, joke, watch him sputter about blood purity, and then suck Regulus off. Well, I mean, I suck Regulus off, and I'm afraid you're not invited to that bit.
James paused, considering, and for a moment he looked like he'd changed his mind. Then he shook his head.
Nah, sorry, not invited.
Remus groaned, putting his head in his hands.
You do this every morning.
Yeah, keeps the portraits humble.
You give Regulus a blowy every morning.
Keeps him in a good mood. You know how Sirius is a terror in the morning. Well, Regulus too, but if he comes before he can get in a strop.
Christ, fine,
Remus said, tearing his jumper up over his head.
Just don't tell me any more about your sex life.
Oh, Mooney.
James sighed, sinking down into a lunge, his bits dangling over the ancient floors of the Black family home.
You know that's a promise I can't keep.
Remus returned home with 2 allies and a sense of grim satisfaction. Just as he thought, Sirius was still asleep, and Remus took down the note he'd left and tossed it in the trash before Sirius ever noticed it. Then he set about making himself a good cup of tea and frying up some hash for when Sirius woke up. Normally he let Sirius do the cooking, but in the days since they'd bonded, he'd felt unusually aware of what Sirius had eaten, a niggling sense of discomfort when he went too long between snacks. He wasn't particularly keen to examine the instincts that were making him act more and more like his own mother, and instead busied himself slicing up onions and streaky bacon, filling the kitchen with the low hum of cooking. He hadn't even finished the toast by the time an owl was tapping at his window. He recognized Regulus's eagle and let it in with a little huff, taking the envelope from its ankle. He expected it to be written in multiple languages again, and was pleasantly surprised when the paper he unfolded was in plain English.
Well done on 2 out of 3. The third ally can be hardest to find, so I've sent along the second ritual for you to work on. Multitasking is very fashionable among the muggles these days. R.A.B. Postscript. Hope you enjoyed morning stretches. Grandfather Arcturus implied you might need a wax. Let me know if you'd like a recommendation. I know a charm.
Remus glared at the letter as he reached back into the envelope. Inside was a scroll, tightly bound with green ribbon, and as he unscrolled it he realized he had been wrong again. Regulus hadn't written it in 3 languages. He'd written in 4.
I didn't know your brother knew Persian,
Remus grumbled when Sirius found him in the kitchen some time later, poring over a dictionary. Sirius was sporting a pair of boxers and an impressive case of bedhead as he stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing grumpily at his face.
Sreggy.
Sirius mumbled, reaching for Remus's teacup and then making a disgruntled face when he tasted it.
Creams. Bad.
Remus flicked his wand to send a cup of tea towards Sirius. He regretted it when the tea knocked against Sirius's nose, and Sirius gave an unhappy whine.
That's yours, love,
Remus said.
No cream, just sugar.
Yum.
Sirius mumbled, taking the tea and downing half of it in one huge sip.
What's Reggie want?
The second ritual,
Remus said.
Why are these written in so many languages?
Sirius shrugged, rubbing the heel of his palm into his eyes.
Ritual. Ness. Important.
You're bullshitting,
Remus said.
Nuh-uh.
Sirius shook his head.
Rules. Rules for everything.
He stretched, scratching at his low belly, which was, admittedly, distracting. Remus tried not to stare.
Rules for marriage and rules for death and rules for how to take a shit.
Are there really?
Remus asked, considering replacing Sirius's hand with his own.
Rules for how to take a shit.
Sirius nodded.
One must not be heard to make flatulence.
He said in an oddly authentic parody of his mother.
Flatulence is for the lower classes.
You couldn't fart.
Sirius shook his head again, took another big sip of tea.
Or verb.
What are you supposed to do with gas?
Turn it into magic, I guess.
Sirius yawned, resting his arms on the table and slumping his head on top of them. Remus was certain that wasn't allowed either.
What languages is this one in?
French, English, Latin, and Persian. Does he know Persian?
I didn't think so.
Sirius mumbled.
But it's not like he got a translator just to make it more difficult for you.
Sirius, your brother would absolutely hire a translator to make things more difficult for me.
Sirius snorted, rubbing his cheek against his arm. Remus scowled down at his paper for a moment longer, and then reached over, smoothing Sirius's hair down some from the rat's nest sleep had transformed it into. Sirius made a pleased noise.
Snice,
he said.
Pets.
The kitchen lapsed back into silence, Remus translating while Sirius dozed beside him. By the time the second ritual was taking shape, Sirius was fully asleep again, his head in the cradle of his arms. Remus listened to him breathe as he read the translated words with a frown on his face.
A foe?
Remus asked.
Sirius, who the fuck is your foe?
Sirius asked, his head jerking up.
Wasate.
The second ritual is to defeat your foe. But it doesn't say who your foe is. Just that the ribbon will glow when I defeat them.
Don't know.
Sirius mumbled, slumping against Remus's side. And then,
Snivellus, maybe.
He flailed out one hand for his tea again and again, picked up Remus's and made an exaggerated face of disgust when he took a sip.
Ugh. Cream. Bad.
This one is yours, love,
Remus said with a sigh, grabbing Sirius's teacup and handing it to him.
Maybe that's your foe.
Mooney.
Sirius sing-songed that afternoon, standing in the back garden with a wrench in his hand and his motorbike nearby.
I found my foe.
Remus leaned out the back window, looking down at him. He was standing in the little dirt patch he did all his motorbike repairs in, wearing a low-slung pair of jeans and black boots, his tattoos shimmering and moving in the sun. He grinned up at Remus, his head thrown back, looking delectable and wild and free.
What foe is that?
Remus asked.
The timing belt is jammed.
Sirius said, waggling the wrench.
Come help me fix it.
Sirius, I don't know the first thing about your blasted motorbike except that you're obsessed with it.
I'll teach you. Come be a second set of hands.
So you can wipe your engine grease on me. No thanks.
Sirius's face fell into a pout.
Mooney. It's my foe.
That bike is not your foe.
Remus said severely.
I think it's the love of your life.
Well, of course she isn't my foe.
Sirius said, touching the bike soothingly, as if Remus had offended it.
But the timing belt might be. And what if that's what completes the ritual, and you don't, and our love is eternally sundered?
Remus rolled his eyes.
Because I wouldn't fuck around with your bike.
You never know,
Sirius said. He tapped his fingers against the windowsill, considering Sirius's biteable pectoral muscles and gnawable arms.
Fine,
he said eventually.
I'll be right down.
The timing belt might have been Remus's foe, he thought glumly as he dragged himself back up to the flat, covered head to toe in engine grease. He didn't know that much grease existed in the world. He smelled terrible. He was sticky. And the green ribbon remained determinately unglowy. He managed to get himself under the shower head and settled in for a proper sulk. He hated doing bike stuff with Sirius. Sirius always waxed poetically about how great his bike was, and meanwhile Remus got covered with 1,000 different substances, each one more odious than the last, and at the end of it Sirius rode the bike and not him, which didn't seem fair for the number of tools he'd handled. And did the ribbon care about the foe he had vanquished? Not at all. Not even a little.
Are you pouting?
Sirius asked, startling Remus out of his reverie. He peeked out of the shower to find Sirius standing in the doorway, still blessedly shirtless, looking amused.
No,
Remus lied.
I've just had a trying day.
You've spent the day with me,
Sirius said.
And James,
Remus added.
Right.
Sirius said.
You're best friends in the whole world.
Doesn't mean you aren't trying,
Remus grumbled. Sirius barked out a laugh.
Or, Mooney. You didn't like working on Gertie with me.
I didn't like Gertie ejaculating whatever this is all over me,
Remus said, gesturing at the black smudges running all down his arms and over his face.
Gertie doesn't ejaculate. She's a girl. She squirts.
Some girls have dicks, Sirius.
Sirius paused to consider, then nodded.
I stand corrected. Girls can ejaculate.
And it clearly wasn't your foe,
Remus said sourly.
That ribbon hasn't changed a bit. And I saw a lot of James's balls this morning. An awful lot, from many angles.
You have had a trying day,
Sirius agreed, a note of soothing in his voice.
Want me to make it up to you?
Remus glanced back at him, expecting Sirius to look mocking. But instead he was slinking forward, and then before Remus knew it he was in the shower with him, his jeans nothing more than a puddle of fabric on the bathroom floor. Sirius's hands fluttered from his chest down to his hips, thumbs rubbing circles on Remus's low belly.
You look so sexy with engine grease on your face,
Sirius murmured, leaning in to kiss him. Remus wanted to be affronted, but Sirius was naked and touching him, and that did wonders for his mood. Instead he busied himself with pulling Sirius flush against him, filling his hands with warm, wet skin. He let out a soft sigh when Sirius rubbed their cocks together, fingers dancing over Sirius's back. Then Sirius was sinking to his knees, leaving a trail of kisses down Remus's front. He settled down between Remus's feet, holding his half-hard cock in one hand.
You're so good to me,
Sirius murmured, kissing the tip of Remus's cock.
So patient. So loving.
Fuck,
Remus whispered, tangling his fingers loosely in Sirius's hair. Sirius's fingers were smudged with engine grease, but he couldn't bring himself to care right then as Sirius moved them in teasing strokes up his length.
I love being yours,
Sirius said, and Remus could feel his lips moving against his cock as he spoke, his tongue flicking out between words.
Love belonging to you.
Sirius,
Remus said.
Love everything about you. Especially this.
He squeezed Remus's cock gently, and Remus bucked his hips.
Fuck, love your cock, Mooney. It's absolutely perfect.
He glanced up at Remus with selfless devotion.
You're absolutely perfect.
Remus's bad mood fled in the face of Sirius's love. He looked down at him, face softening, rubbing his thumb over Sirius's jaw.
Love,
he said quietly. Sirius licked one perfect stroke from Remus's balls to the tip of his cock, humming in pleasure as Remus thickened in his hand. Then he wrapped his fingers around the base of Remus's cock, flashed him a grin, and swallowed him down. Remus groaned as he felt the scorching heat of Sirius's mouth swallowing around him. He couldn't help the way he thrust forward, or the way his stomach clenched when Sirius gagged around him. He loved Sirius like this, on his knees, messy and drooling, doing everything he could to keep pace with the rhythm Remus set. It was almost a competition to see who would falter first, whether Remus would cave into the pleasure of Sirius's mouth and come down his throat, or fuck his mouth hard enough that Sirius would have no choice but to cling to his thighs and take it. Remus tightened his fingers in Sirius's hair, snapping his hips forward, and Sirius moaned around him, the sound traveling up Remus's spine. Sirius resisted his hold on his hair, bobbed his head in quick, messy bursts. He pulled back just far enough to suck wetly at the head of his cock, his cheeks hollowing around him.
Fuck,
Remus grunted, and then thrust back into his mouth. Sirius whined in agreement, fingers curling around the backs of Remus's thighs. Remus grinned in something like triumph. It was a sure sign that he was winning, that soon Sirius's lashes would touch his cheeks and he would go slack-jawed and willing, taking everything Remus saw fit to give him, and by the time Remus came on his face he'd be so hard he'd be dizzy with it. Remus curled his fingers around the back of Sirius's head, dragging him forward, and for a moment he just held him there, his cock brushing the back of Sirius's throat, Sirius moaning helplessly around him at the feel of it.
That's it,
Remus said.
Just like that, love.
When Remus released him, Sirius pulled off with a ragged breath before pulling Remus back into his mouth, slurping loudly around his cock, taking Remus as deep as he could. Remus fucked deeper, holding Sirius's hair, waiting for the telltale hitch in his breath that meant Remus had won their little game. He was so focused on watching Sirius's face that he didn't notice his fingers, and registered only the surprising press against his arse, and then the blinding, dizzying pleasure as Sirius found his prostate with unerring accuracy, pressed and held as he took Remus's cock down to the hilt. Remus shouted as he came, his knees buckling under the force of his orgasm, vision whiting out. Sirius didn't let up, massaging his prostate as aftershocks tore through him, until he was pleading senselessly, a garbled string of Sirius's name and half-uttered curses falling out of his mouth.
Fuck, baby, fuck, Christ, Sirius, fuck.
Remus gasped, half collapsed against the shower wall and panting like he'd run a marathon. Sirius pulled off with a pleased little hum, leaving almost innocent kisses over Remus's quivering thighs.
Told you engine grease wasn't half bad,
Sirius said, ducking his head to suckle wetly at the base of Remus's cock, the sensitive skin where a knot might form. Remus moaned, his legs beginning to outright tremble.
What fuck, Sirius, what does that mean?
Sirius kissed his softening cock and then back over to his thighs, nuzzling him.
It makes halfway decent lube, doesn't it?
Realization hit Remus, and later when the afterglow wore off he would be sure to hang Sirius out the window for his cheek. In the moment, he could only give a whimpering noise of disgust.
You lubed my ass with engine grease.
You're fine.
Sirius scoffed.
You're not the first person to get a bit of engine grease up the tush.
You lubed my ass with engine grease.
Just enough to get you off,
Sirius said smugly.
It worked, didn't it?
Remus closed his eyes and tilted his head up towards the ceiling, the shower spray cascading over his chest and down his belly.
When we find your foe, love,
he said slowly, with great intention,
I am handing you right over to them.
Chapter 4. Sirius had a lot of foes. First there were the people. Snape was his most notable foe, but Sirius made enemies quickly, and often with very little explanation. He hated the next-door neighbors, the Richards. When asked, Sirius said they were pompous and rude and had unreasonable opinions about people jogging in the summertime. Remus wasn't sure he'd ever spoken to them. It didn't matter, though. Sirius hated them fervently and with zeal. They weren't the only ones. When they went to the grocery together, Sirius always picked a new nemesis, someone who moved too slowly or quickly through the aisles. Remus could usually tell who it was, because by the end Sirius would be scowling at them heavily instead of helping him shop. It happened outside the grocery, too, with people who had a bad sensation or people who gave him odd looks or, and most especially, people who frowned at dogs. Sirius abhorred people who frowned at dogs. Sirius's foes weren't constrained to just humans. There were also vague concepts. Hunger. Thirst. Boredom. In the days that followed, Remus found himself battling specific things, like Sirius's need for a drink of water at 2 in the morning, and more generic things, like the concept of saran wrap.
It just makes me feel uncomfortable,
Sirius said with a sigh.
It's too tight.
You don't put it on your body,
Remus said despairingly.
Some people do.
Sirius said.
Who?
Sirius shrugged.
I don't know. It's just a feeling I have. Somewhere out there, somebody is putting saran wrap on their body. And it's altogether too tight.
Remus thunked his own head against the wall, which otherwise might have given him a headache, but he already had one.
Great, Padfoot, fine,
he said weakly.
I'll battle the idea of people putting saran wrap on their body.
No, just saran wrap in general,
Sirius said.
The body's thing is just an extra.
It had been days of this, a new foe around every corner. The lack of coffee in the kitchen was a foe. Sirius's need for a new record was a foe. The idea of sad dogs was a foe. The reality of sad dogs was a crisis, although Remus was used to that one. He wondered if the Muggles knew who was funding the new and improved animal shelters around London. Despite Remus's best efforts to ward off hunger, bad dreams, the woman who took too long picking peanut butter at the shops, the man who went too fast picking ice at the shops, some Muggles who gave Sirius a stomachache, and Gilderoy Lockhart himself, the ribbon Regulus sent him remained stubbornly unglowing. Remus wondered if it could glow, if it was just an ordinary Muggle ribbon and Regulus was fucking with him. The idea seemed likely. Hell, the idea seemed obvious. Regulus certainly wasn't going to answer his questions, and when asked, Sirius had an unsettling habit of sinking to his knees, and then Remus was too busy fucking his throat to think of questions. James wouldn't spill, and Andromeda was too frightening to approach again. That left one option.
I'm going to the bookstore with Benji today,
Remus announced over breakfast.
Want to come?
Sirius squinted in displeasure.
Benji smells like talcum powder and he only ever talks about lacrosse.
You can just say no, love.
Is it a lacrosse bookstore?
You know it's not. And Benji has many hobbies besides his mild interest in a singular Muggle sport.
Does he?
Sirius asked.
Then why does he only talk about lacrosse?
Remus pinched the bridge of his nose.
I'm going to take that as a no.
Don't you come back playing lacrosse?
Sirius huffed.
Maybe lacrosse is my foe.
Shut up, Sirius.
Maybe your unwillingness to admit Benji's lacrosse addiction is my foe.
Shut up, Sirius.
Maybe.
Shut up, Sirius.
Remus growled, just enough alpha in his voice to make Sirius cross his arms, a pink flush over his cheeks.
Well, you didn't have to make this agenda thing.
Sirius grumbled, pushing his chair back from the table and flouncing off to be a nightmare in the other room. Remus didn't get a chance to knock on the huge mahogany doors of the house before a house elf swung the door open and bowed to him dramatically, his nose brushing the ground.
Sir is very welcome.
Thank you,
Remus said, bowing in return. When he straightened up, the house elf was beaming at him.
My name is Remus Lupin. I owled ahead.
Sir is expected.
The house elf said, opening the door wide.
Please, sir must enter.
Remus stepped into the lavish entryway, sparing a glance for the massive black family crest on the wall. The house smelled of leather and smoke, and beneath his feet the hardwood gleamed. It was the kind of undeniable richness that he was still getting used to. Black family homes were like this, so opulent it was almost understated, like they'd gone so far towards rich they'd wrapped the other way around again. It was a far cry from the flat Sirius loved, where the most expensive thing was Sirius's vinyl collection and one very luxurious rug Regulus had gifted them. He took a moment to be grateful that Sirius had rebelled from his family so thoroughly, and that he was so opposed to Benji Flitwick that Remus could use him as an excuse whenever he needed alone time. But all his thoughts were scattered as he was led into a bright, elegant tea room where Alfred Black was sitting. Alfred rose when he saw Remus. He had the customary black cheekbones, dark hair and gray eyes, his robes silver and tight-fitting. Even in his old age he was tall, handsome. He smiled at Remus and held out one hand, which Remus shook.
"Young Master Lupin,"
Alfred said.
"It's a pleasure to hear from you."
Thank you for making time for me,
Remus said.
I was surprised you remembered me from James and Regulus's wedding.
Alfred sat in a cream and leather chair, smiling fondly.
"I must admit you were brought to my attention sooner than that. Sirius writes to me about you frequently."
He does.
"Indeed, and I'm grateful to say the tune of his letters has changed now that he's no longer pining after you and actually in a relationship with you. I confess there are only so many times a man can hear about his nephew's best friend smelling like heaven before he tires of the comparison."
Remus rubbed awkwardly at the back of his neck.
We did sort of miscommunicate for about a decade.
The entire family is relieved this is at an end."
I thought some might be offended. I'm no pure blood.
"Pa,"
Alfred said, waving one hand.
"my father is dead, as is my sister. We can put such notions to bed without risking their ire. None of my lovers are purebloods."
Remus coughed discreetly into his hand.
Ah.
Alfred smiled, crossing one leg over the other.
"Wizards live a long time, Master Lupin. One must nourish oneself."
Do I know any?
Alfred said.
"I don't kiss and tell, unlike my nephew, who wrote me an entire essay on the matter of your bonding. 3 claiming bites. Emphatic."
He had just been kidnapped.
"Sirius is always getting kidnapped. He is, as I believe the young people say, a wreck. Charming boy."
Always. This has happened before.
"A few times in his childhood. Some centaurs stole him right out of my sister's hands when he was a toddler. Tried to claim him as their mascot. I believe he would have enjoyed the role quite a bit, but alas, Orion's father Arcturus negotiated his safe return. And then when he was 6, a harpy swooped down during a family picnic and stole him. Raised him as her chick for a month or so before Walburga located the nest. Picnics were banned after that."
Remus stared at Alfred.
Are you kidding?
Alfred shook his head.
"I'm afraid not. No picnics until this day."
He never said.
"Well, chirp at him sometime and see what it gets you. That's my first piece of advice for your new bond."
Remus blinked rapidly at the cream carpet, trying to digest the information. Then, remembering why he had come, he looked back up at Alfred.
That's why I'm here. Our bond. I want to ask, will you be my ally for the first ritual?
Alfred frowned a little, and Remus felt a stirring of unease.
"The ritual?"
Alfred said.
Yes, Andromeda agreed, and James. Sir, I just need a third. And I was hoping it'd be you.
"And what, precisely, did they agree to?"
To be my ally,
Remus said. Alfred looked at him blankly.
My ally in the ritual, the first ritual, the ancient house of Black Rit. Regulus is fucking with me, isn't he?
"I'm afraid I believe he is,"
Alfred agreed.
There are no rituals to claim an Omega of the House of Black, are there?
"Besides bribing their father, no."
Those bastards.
Alfred nodded.
"Indeed, my nephews are. I assume Sirius has been going along with this charade."
And James,
Remus said indignantly.
And Andromeda.
"Well, that's no surprise. Andromeda regularly creates mischief. In some ways, I suppose it's an initiation into the family. And you may be grateful it has involved no blood."
Alfred paused.
"It has involved no blood."
Not yet, but I spent an hour last week parsing Persian and French, and Sirius put engine grease in my asshole and I got up at 3 in the morning to fetch him a pudding cup.
Alfred winced.
"Engine grease? From his muggle machine?"
Which I had to help him work on.
"Frightful, my boy."
I'm going to murder them. I'm sorry, Alfred, but I'm going to kill your nephews.
"Nonsense,"
Alfred said.
"You're going to get revenge instead. And although I can't be your ally in the ritual, seeing as it doesn't exist, I can certainly be your ally in revenge."
Really?
Remus asked.
Consider it a bonding gift.
Alfred said cheerfully.
And really, it'd be shameful to leave a Gryffindor alone to seek revenge. You'll end up saving them heroically instead. No, you need a Slytherin for such matters.
Alfred, I'm in your debt.
Alfred leaned forward and patted Remus tenderly on the hand.
No, son. Thanks to you, Sirius has ceased to describe the way the sunlight plays on the curls in your hair each week. At this point, we can consider ourselves even.
Alfred worked faster than Remus could imagine. He set the stage masterfully, called in the favors, and even bribed the Muggle police to keep it a secret. For his part, all Remus had to do was continue to honor Sirius's ludicrous ideas about foes, and show up at noon on Thursday at Grimmauld Place.
You're sure she'll help us?
Remus had asked, watching as Alfred penned a quick letter at a desk that surely cost more than Remus's childhood home.
Certain. My niece loved chaos,
Alfred said.
It makes her a lovely collaborator and a terrible dinner guest.
As confident as he was in Alfred's abilities, Remus was still shocked when he found Bellatrix waiting for him in front of Grimmauld Place 3 days later. She wore a long black dress, her hair falling in dark waves, and she eyed him with a kind of disdain that made him feel a little queasy.
Beta,
she said in greeting, twirling her long wand between her elegant fingers and sharp, dark fingernails.
I'm an alpha, actually,
Remus said.
As you know.
Bellatrix shrugged, her eyes sweeping over him.
If the shoe fits, Beta.
Remus bit the inside of his cheek. Bellatrix smelled of something metallic, gold, or blood, and roses, and beneath it an almost undetectable layer of mint. She tapped her heeled boot against the cobblestones, and distantly Remus wondered how long she'd stand there before she began blowing things up for sport. He didn't have to wonder for long. Only a few minutes had gone by when Bellatrix turned her neck to the side, cracking it loudly, before summarily drawing her wand and aiming at his wand.
Begin,
she ordered. Remus opened his mouth to say that the others hadn't arrived yet, but the words didn't have a chance to leave his mouth. She cursed him, searing pain shooting up his left arm, and anything he had to say was replaced by a choked cry. He could only be grateful she hadn't got his wand arm. He jerked his wand out with his right hand and sent a hurried confringo at her. Bellatrix laughed, high and pealing, as the flames gathered at the hem of her skirt, and then extinguished altogether.
You'll have to do better than that, sweet toy,
Bellatrix crowed. Harsh blue light flew from her wand, and Remus barely had time to fling himself at the ground. It sailed over his head, and behind him, a light post exploded. When he got to his feet, he saw Sirius. Sirius was standing in the doorway of Grimmauld Place, his mouth open in horror, his wand drawn. Behind him were James and Regulus, and behind them Alfred, putting on a show of distress even as he cast the shielding charm that kept Sirius from coming any closer.
Bellatrix!
Sirius screamed, slamming his fists against the shield.
Bellatrix, you miserable cunt, come here.
Bellatrix danced to the side, blowing a kiss towards Sirius and, in the same motion, flinging a knife at Remus. Remus dodged, but he was close enough to hear the sound the knife made as it sliced into the cobblestones, and a chill ran down his back. No knife should be sharp enough to cut stone, and yet. She was distracted, gloating at Sirius, and Remus used the moment to blast her backwards. She flew up off the pavement, landing on her ass a few feet behind.
I'll defeat you,
Remus said, his throat raw, the lines rehearsed.
You're Sirius's biggest foe, and I'll defeat you, and end this.
No.
Sirius screamed, and there was a blast of magic, cloves and citrus, Sirius fighting against the shield charm.
No, Mooney, stop. No.
Defeat me,
Bellatrix laughed, rising to her feet. There was a trickle of blood running from her mouth. She wiped it with her finger, and then licked the finger clean, staring Remus down.
You'll die here, beast.
Bellatrix, I'll give you the family.
Regulus called from Sirius's side, his voice frantic.
The inheritance. The title. Leave him unharmed and you can have it.
I don't want your used goods.
Bellatrix sneered.
You dare bargain with me, Beta that you are.
I'll tell you where grandfather buried your first wand.
Regulus said.
I'll divorce Narcissa from Lucius. I'll give you anything you want.
His voice was edging into hysterical as Sirius beat against the shield. Beside him, James was casting every spell he knew. Sirius let out a cry, and then there was a noise like thunder rumbling over the hills, and the cobblestones beneath them began to shudder. Before Remus could make sense of it, a hole had appeared under Alfred's charm, and Sirius was forcing his way through it, his magic tearing the street apart, water lines erupting beneath their feet and geysering into the air. Remus couldn't comprehend the amount of effort it had taken, didn't know Sirius was capable of such a thing. He shouldn't have been surprised, but he was, enough to drop the act and stare as Sirius's magic tore the world apart to get to him. Sirius was almost to him, shoving through the rubble and debris out of his way, reaching frantic fingers out to Remus. But then,
"No, little cousin, that's mine,"
Bellatrix said darkly, and just as Sirius came out on the other side of the shield, she flicked her wand, and there was a green light, and Remus disappeared from existence. Well, not from existence. Just to inside the parlor, really. He pulled the port key from his pocket and set it on the mantelpiece, waving at Ted, who was sitting on a sofa, nursing a fresh glass of lemonade.
How'd it go?
Ted asked.
Your wife is terrifying,
Remus said.
Christ, I know.
Ted agreed.
Attractive, isn't it?
I thought she was actually going to kill me.
I've thought that a time or two,
Ted said.
Always turned out all right, so far, at least.
How does she manage to look so much like Bellatrix? Not the face, I mean, but the expressions.
Ted shrugged, but whatever he was going to say was cut off by a pop, and then Bellatrix stood beside them. Well, Andromeda, looking gleeful in her sister's dress.
Sirius tore up the entire street. Regulus is going to have to pay the Muggles 1,000 galleons to keep that quiet.
You're a menace,
Ted said affectionately, and Andromeda dropped into his lap, leaning in to press a kiss on his jaw. There were loud footsteps then, James and then Regulus, both red-faced.
Creature!
Regulus screamed, racing by the parlor they sat in.
Creature, I need the minister immediately.
The ministers of England or of France?
Creature asked somewhere nearby.
All of them.
Regulus shrieked, sounding something like his mother.
"Come in, nephew,"
came Alfred's voice.
"Let's come inside. Take a breath, there's a boy. I'm sure your Remus is, well, I'll not say all right, but perhaps alive or easily resuscitated. There's a Muggle saying, you know, hope is the last to die."
How long should we give it?
Remus asked.
At least a few minutes more.
Andromeda said.
Let them suffer.
Maida,
Ted scolded.
Hush, pet.
Andromeda said.
This is a Slytherin project. You knew what you were agreeing to.
Sirius sounds distraught,
Ted said speculatively.
Sirius woke me up at 2 in the morning to hold his hand while he took a piss last night,
Remus said dryly. Ted considered this.
At least a minute more, then,
he agreed. When Remus finally did make his appearance, strolling casually into the sitting room where Regulus was hyperventilating and James had his head in the fireplace, speaking in sharp, frantic sentences to the minister, it took Sirius a moment to notice him, busy as he was cutting open his own palm and letting huge droplets of blood spill over a map of England, an incantation mumbled under his breath. In fact, Regulus noticed him first, his face twisting between relieved to murderous to awed in a matter of seconds. He clutched his wand in one hand, his chest heaving, before grabbing a handful of James's robes and yanking. James jerked back from the fireplace and followed his husband's unspoken command to where Remus stood, and his face fell open in outright relief.
You cunt,
Regulus said in something like awe. Sirius looked up, blood still pouring out of his palm, and he stilled, a storm in a man's body. He took in a jagged breath and then pitched himself forward, falling on Remus, sinking to his knees with a hoarse cry.
Mooney.
Sirius gasped.
Mooney. Remus. Love.
Hi, Padfoot,
Remus said, and despite his pleasure at a scheme well hatched, he felt a twinge of ache at the sorrow in Sirius's voice.
Did you miss me?
In response, Sirius rubbed his face against Remus's thigh, gasping like he had been holding his breath for too long.
I had a plan.
Regulus complained.
I was making points.
Turnabout is fair play, little cousin,
Andromeda said. She looked herself again, her rounder cheeks replacing Bellatrix's gaunt stare, her hair light, and most importantly, Ted Tonks with one arm around her.
Don't fuss because you got outmaneuvered, it's poor sportsmanship.
And you traitor.
Regulus gasped.
I gave you full rights to the summer estate for this.
Andromeda shrugged.
You didn't have a betrayal clause in our agreement.
I trusted you.
Regulus shouted.
Learn from that.
Andromeda said.
James, Regulus, it's nice to see you.
Ted said brightly.
Hi, Ted.
James croaked.
Mooney.
Sirius gasped, his face pressed flush to Remus's groin. Remus took a handful of Sirius's hair, tenderly tilted his head back so their eyes could meet. Sirius looked dazed, clutching at Remus's thighs like a lifeline. Remus smiled down at him.
I love you, Sirius Black. Don't you ever fuck with me again.
Let me suck your dick.
Sirius breathed, worshipful.
I think we should go.
Ted said.
I thought we could have a family brunch.
Alfred said.
I made reservations.
I need to suck his dick first.
Sirius whispered.
The reservations are at 2.
Alfred said doubtfully.
What time is it?
James asked.
1:15.
Ted answered.
We've got time.
Sirius said, hooking his fingers in Remus's waistband.
This was all leading to a bonding present. Lupin, you unfathomable bow-truckle fucking plan ruiner.
Regulus said.
I don't think that's what he fucks.
Ted said.
Don't be jealous, nephew.
Alfred said, patting Regulus's shoulder consolingly.
Everyone gets outdone sometimes. Let your brother have his coitus in peace.
Don't call it coitus.
Sirius said in the same reverent tone, not breaking eye contact with Remus. Regulus made a grumbling noise, and Remus watched out of the corner of his eye as he stalked from the room, the others gradually drifting out, their voices carrying as they made off towards the garden. Remus stroked his thumb over the hinge of Sirius's jaw.
You all right, love?
I thought you died.
Sirius said.
You made me hold your hand when you took a piss.
Remus reminded him. Sirius nodded without breaking eye contact.
That's fair.
He said. And then,
You're so fucking attractive when you prank.
Remus grinned.
Well, we have enough time before lunch to figure out our next move. Convince Regulus James accidentally bonded with a straight girl, or something.
Sirius moaned, mouthing at Remus through his trousers.
Fuck, Mooney, I love it when you talk dirty to me.
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora and Kailana.